Adding cabinets to your garage, your basement, or your workshop is one of the best things you can do to get organized. And building them yourself is a lot easier than you think. In this video, I'm compiling all of my cabinet build videos to show you how I took this garage from an empty space into a full organized cabinet set. And I'm going to show you everything that you need to know, including how to make and space drawers, carcass assembly, making the upper cabinets with custom storage, leveling and installing the base cabinets, and even how to put a miter saw in to get your own custom miter saw station. And I thought now would be the perfect time for this video because in the very near future, I'm going to be having to do a whole new setup. But more on that later. Right now, let's jump into building some cabinets. It all started right here with these upper cabinets. I had some old store-bought ones that were in bad shape that I needed to replace. Today I'm going to show you how to make DIY wall cabinets with 5 different storage options. I've had these cheap cabinets in my shop for years, and they were great, until this happened. Yeah, they literally fell apart from the weight. So I gave the cabinet a wooden peg leg to keep it from totally falling off the wall, and I started building some new ones. I wanted the new cabinets to be heavy duty and able to hold a ton of weight, so I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood for the carcass, and I'll have a full 1/2 inch back to tie it all together. I started by breaking down the plywood into the right widths for the frame of the cabinets. Now labeling your parts here is a great way to keep them organized, especially when you're making 2 cabinets at the same time, which I affectionately dubbed Cabinet A and Cabinet B. The tops, bottoms, and sides are the same for both cabinets, and I cut them to width using my crosscut sled and a stop block on my fence. One of the storage options for the cabinets is to make flexible cubby storage with removable dividers. The slots are sized for 1/4 inch plywood, and I made the cuts in 2 passes using a test piece to get exactly the right fit for my plywood. After I knew the size of the slot I needed, I started making slots into the plywood, working my way from the outside in. Now on each pass I would flip the board 180 degrees and make a cut on the opposite side, so I was taking advantage of one setup to make 2 cuts. I worked my way to the middle until I had all the slots cut. Then I just ripped the piece in half to get a bottom and center shelf for Cabinet B. I'm using pocket hole joinery for the cabinet frame, and each top, bottom, and the center shelf for Cabinet B got pocket holes on the ends. Before assembly, the sides need a few more steps to be done. So I'm attaching a 1/2 inch back into a recessed groove or a rabbet on the sides. I switched over to my dado blade and I made the rabbet cuts, but this could also be made in 2 passes with a regular blade or with a router bit. Again, I used a test cut here to make sure my setup gave a good fit, then I made the cuts on the inside back edge of each side. Now several of the storage options come from different shelves in the cabinets, and drilling the shelf pin holes now before assembly is much easier than after it's together. Cabinet B will have the modular cubbies that I cut the slots for earlier, so the sides only need shelf pin holes on the top portion above the center shelf. Cabinet A, on the other hand, will have adjustable shelving from the top to the bottom with a center divider to make half-width shelves. I marked directly on the parts to keep everything straight, and then I drilled holes the length of the left side. I repeated the process on the center divider and knocked out the whole row, maybe just a little too quickly. I was about to flip this over and start on the other side and I realized I just messed this up. These holes are too low because this is actually going to have a top on it. This is going to be inside. Make sure you don't make that mistake. So I need to cut a new piece and adjust all these holes up the thickness of the plywood. Make sure you're marking it and think about what you're doing before you do it. This time I factored in the thickness of the top and offset the shelf pins, though I did drill a few errant holes yet again. See if you can pick those out in the rest of the video. I started to flip over the divider and use the shelf pin jig on the other side. Then I realized I could just drill straight through the holes that I'd already done. As long as your shelf pins stick into the wood less than 3/8 of an inch, this works great and saves time not having to offset the holes on the other side. I finished up with the shelf pins on the right side and I was ready for assembly. The bottoms and tops are joined into the sides to keep a clean exterior for the cabinet. I used 1 1/4 inch pocket screws and corner clamps to hold things tight while I secured the bottom to the side. I finished up the frame assembly for Cabinet A, attaching the top to the side, and then putting the remaining side on, securing everything with screws. The key during assembly is just to make sure that the front faces are flush and that the corners are square. The center divider for Cabinet A went in next. The divider was left slightly long so I could adjust for an exact fit when I had the frame assembled, but I made sure to cut off the bottom of the center divider because I referenced all the shelf pin locations off the top. The divider was held in place flush with the back with a long clamp. Then I pre-drilled through the top and bottom and secured it in place with 1¼ inch screws, checking for square as I went. The cabinet B is assembled much the same way as cabinet A. The only difference is having the center shelf instead of the center divider. I used wooden spacers to get consistent spacing between the bottom and center shelf and attached everything together with pocket screws. I measured the cabinets and cut the backs to size from 1/2 inch plywood. And the backs sit in that recessed rabbet that I made earlier, but they fully overlap the top and bottom. I laid down a bead of glue all around the perimeter, and then I secured the back onto the cabinet B with brad nails on the sides. Then I followed up with 1¼ inch screws, pre-drilled and screwed into the top and bottom. Now all the interior shelves in cabinet A are made from 1/2 inch plywood. I ribbed a few strips to width on the table saw, and then I cut them down to length based on my cut list. If you want plans for this build, they'll have a full cut list, parts list, and step-by-step instructions. Head to the link down in the description, or you can use the card above. And the right side shelves will just hold cans, but the left side of the cabinet will hold spray cans. So I mocked it up to see how the fit was. But this wasn't perfect since it covered up most of the label, and the can had a tendency to roll. So I went back to the table saw, and I cut the shelves down about 3/4 inch. And as a bonus, I used the offcut as my spacer strips. And this worked much better for visibility of the label. Now to fix the rolling, I laid out 5 marks on the strip, and I made some small notches on the back side of the spacer strips with a chamfer bit. This was enough to hold the cans in place and keep them from rolling. Then I glued and nailed the strips to the shelves and moved on to the shelves and inserts for cabinet B. Now the top of this cabinet got a full-length shelf. I used 3/4 inch plywood for this one to prevent sagging since it runs the full width of the cabinet. For the lower slots, I cut down 1/4 inch plywood into a series of small panels that I'll slide into place later to make the cubbies. Now the last set of storage options are racks on the doors. If you're not ready to build new cabinets yet, this could be a great way to add some storage to your current setup. Now each of these add-ons is made from 1/2 inch plywood. I made some slight modifications in the plans to help reduce weight even further after I built these. I cut all the pieces to size per my cut list to make 4 different size racks and holders. To give the door racks a little refinement, I laid out a curve on the top corners of the sides, using a small section of PVC pipe to trace a nice radius. After that, I taped each pair of sides together and cut the majority of the corner off at the bandsaw. Then I went over to the spindle sander and sanded down to my line. Now this can easily be done with a jigsaw and a hand sander as well. I went through a progression of different assembly methods making these door racks until I landed on the best way. I started off making the tall racks using a right angle block clamped down to my bench, and I attached the sides and fronts with a 23 gauge pin nailer and glue. But I realized the issue wasn't so much the support, but it was the strength of the joints. So for the final 2 door racks, I switched over to my 18 gauge brad nailer, and I just held the parts in place using a right angle square in my hand versus being locked down to a fixed reference. And the brad nails held together way better. I was trying to hide the holes with the 23 gauge pin nailer, but it just isn't beefy enough. The last thing I needed to make before assembly was the doors for the cabinets. I cut the doors from 3/4 inch plywood, and I used a large sheet to get continuous grain between them. To hold up to the extra weight of the door racks and the contents, I'm using 3 hinges per door here. I laid out the locations for the hinges on both the doors and the cabinet bodies per the mounting instructions. And I'm using these full overlay European style door hinges. Using a jig, I drilled holes for the hinge cups on the doors at the marks that I'd made earlier, and I drilled 2 pilot holes for the screws. These hinges fit right in the holes, and they're going to stay concealed out of the way. I drilled the 3 holes in each door, and then I moved over to the cabinet. On the cabinet side, I used a template from the hinge packaging to lay out for the mounting plates. I marked the locations and drilled pilot holes for installation later. To give the cabinets some protection, I'm using polyacrylic from Minwax. In between coats, I use a small section of craft paper or a brown paper bag to smooth the surface. When the paper picks up this white dust, you know the finish is dry and ready for another coat. And using that paper bag after the final coat also knocks down any dust nibs for a smooth finish. I installed the door hardware, and then I mounted all the door racks to the doors with small right angle brackets and screws. Mounting the new cabinets without the doors is way easier, so I hung those up and then put the doors on afterwards. Now, cabinet B holds a lot of my finishing supplies, and the cubbies are great for storing stuff that wants to go everywhere, like rags and chip brushes. And having a spot on the door for my nitrile gloves is sweet for that grab and go usage when I'm using stains, epoxy, or finish. And cabinet A is going to hold all my finishes. The half-width shelves hold 9 quart cans and 20 spray cans with room for taller items at the bottom. The large door rack holds 16 pint cans or mason jars, and the other door holds some caulk and some other small items. You can mix and match any of these 5 storage options to build your own custom wall cabinet.
Now, the next thing to complement upper cabinets is obviously a set of base cabinets. So I jumped in and did some basic ones with doors, but added in a little flair with some pull-out trays and some additional storage.
Now, I'm using Baltic birch plywood like I do on all of my shop projects because I just love how stable and solid it is. Now, I'll be building 2 cabinets with different storage options in each one. I started off by cutting the sides for both cabinets from my 3/4 inch plywood. And then I moved to my workbench to mark for the toe kick. Now, the toe kicks are just a simple notch out on each side, and it gets the same cut for every piece. So I laid out the measurement on one piece, and then I flipped through the other sides, marking the location of the notch on each one. I've cut these before with a jigsaw, but using a fence on a bandsaw is much easier and it's more repeatable. And once you get that cut set up, it can be repeated on all the sides, just cutting to the end lines that I marked out earlier. To finish the notch, I flipped the piece and I adjusted the fence for that second cut line. Now this one is even easier as you just cut until that piece releases and there's your notch. Next I went back to the table saw and I cut the parts to connect the sides together. Now each cabinet will have a full bottom piece, 2 small top supports, and 2 supports on the back. I pulled out my pocket hole jig and I drilled holes in all the connecting pieces for joinery. Now, pocket holes are a great option for shop cabinetry as they're fast, easy, and they provide you all the strength that you need. To help hold the parts together, I'm using corner clamps. The clamps hold the parts square and it has a little recess that fits right over the pocket hole. You can hold everything tight and still drive in the screw without needing to move the clamp. These top supports for the cabinet are going to hold and secure the worktop to the cabinets later, and the back supports will be used to attach them to the wall. The cabinet I'm working on now is going to have a full-size adjustable shelf above a pull-out tray on the bottom. And drilling the holes for the shelf pins is pretty easy using a jig to reference the front and the back of each side. I drilled the holes in the middle section of both sides, and then I moved on to making the pull-out tray. I'm using 110-degree European hinges for the doors, and they don't swing fully out of the way of the sides when open. So to keep the tray's drawer slides from hitting the doors, I needed to install some 1/2-inch spacers here. I glued and brad nailed the shims on each side using a piece of 1/4 inch plywood to raise them off the base. To finish off the carcass construction, I measured and cut a back for the cabinet out of 1/4 inch plywood. The back can be installed with brad nails or staples, and it'll help keep the cabinet from shifting out of square. I'm installing these cabinets along the side wall of my garage, and from one end of the run to the other, there's about an inch drop to deal with. So having adjustable feet for these cabinets is a must. I cut and attached these blocks with brad nails and glue to the bottom corners, where I'll install leveling feet after the glue dries. And next I went back to the table saw to cut the parts for the pull-out tray. This tray is very basic with just 4 short sides that are cut to fit in the cabinet with a 1/4 inch plywood bottom. I didn't do anything special here for the joinery, just glue and brad nails. You can get away with this with Baltic birch since the edges of the plywood have so much long grain in them. But if you're using lesser quality plywood, some screws here can really quickly strengthen those connections. The bottom is attached with glue and staples, which really lock the whole tray together and make it a solid assembly. And to hide that plywood bottom from being seen from the front or the sides, I used a chamfer bit in my router to bevel it back. Now when you're done, you can't tell the difference between this and a floating bottom panel in a groove. And this glued on panel is really strong since basically it just becomes one piece. To mount the pull-out tray, I used full extension drawer slides. I attached the slides to the shims that I installed earlier with small mounting screws, pre-drilling the holes first. Then I used that same 1/4 inch plywood scrap to hold the tray off the bottom and put the tray between the sides. A few screws on each side hold the tray in place. I really love having this slide out tray like this. It's a great option so you don't have to dig for items in the back of a cabinet. With the carcass complete, I moved on to the doors for this cabinet. I like the clean slab look for my doors, and one thing I think is underrated is making sure the grain is going the direction you want and cutting the doors consecutively from the sheet of plywood for a continuous grain look. This just makes it look so much nicer, and oh does it soothe my OCD. Now next I put the cabinet on its side to position and install the hinges. I marked the layout lines for the center of each hinge on the cabinet. Then I transferred those marks onto some blue painter tape that I put on the doors so I can reference my hinge drilling jig on it. I'm using a concealed hinge jig here that makes drilling out these cups pretty foolproof. You don't have to have a jig to get it done, but it sure does make it a heck of a lot easier and faster. For the cabinet side of the hinges, I used the template included in the hinge packaging to mark and drill the holes. And with everything in place, the install is pretty easy. I usually install hinge doors to the cabinet once the cabinet is standing up, and I have no idea why I've done this in the past. Doing it this way on its side is way easier. I repeated the process on the other side, and I just needed to install the leveling feet to finish up the cabinet. Now here are the pieces that I'm using for the leveling feet. It's just a 5/16 of an inch T-nut and a 2-inch carriage bolt. I used a 3/8 of an inch drill bit and marked it with tape to drill deep enough for the full bolt to go into so I can have a full 2 inches of travel on this leveler. After drilling out the hole, the T-nut insert gets hammered in, and it's a quick and easy leveler foot that you can make on the cheap. Now the second cabinet carcass is made exactly the same way as the first, until we get to the internal storage. Now this cabinet's going to have a shorter adjustable shelf that will leave room for storage on the doors. I clamped a piece of scrap plywood to the front edge, and I used it as a reference for that jig, which worked out great. And to account for the extra weight of the storage on the doors, I went to 3 hinges on this cabinet versus 2. I installed them the same way as before, and I just added the extra hinge right there in the middle of the door. The cubbies for the doors are really pretty basic as well. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood for the bottom and the sides, and 1/4 inch plywood for the front strips. I cut 2 different sizes, one for glue bottles and one for spray paint. And they ended up being 2 3/4 of an inch and 2.5 inches, which seemed very necessary at the time for a snug fit. But really, it just goes to further prove my OCD. I mean, come on, man. Just make them all 2 3/4 of an inch. Jeez. I like the look of the cubbies from my wall cabinets, so I made these the same way with a rounded corner on the top. A group of sides can all be cut at the same time on the bandsaw by wrapping them together with tape, or you could cut them individually with a jigsaw. Now just make sure you have your stacks of 1/4 inch different pieces aligned down to the nearest 64th of an inch. Now after cutting both stacks, I smoothed the rough edges on my oscillating belt sander, but you could easily do this with an orbital sander as well. The cubby bottoms are connected to the sides with pocket screws. Then I measured up and made a reference line for the top rail and secured it with brad nails. The lower rail goes on flush with the bottom of the cubby with brad nails as well. And then you have a nice little holder for extra bottles and cans that can go right on the door. But before installing them, I wanted to drill the door hardware and put some finish on the cabinets. I drilled the holes for the handles with the Craig cabinet hardware jig, and yes, I learned from my mistake on the last video, and I checked the width between the holes first. I applied 2 coats of water-based polyurethane to the cabinet doors and sides for protection against wear and tear. When the finish was dry, I removed the doors from the second cabinet and pre-drilled and attached those cubbies. Now the only thing to keep in mind here is to make sure that they're mounted far enough away from the edge to make sure they won't hit the other door when they're swinging open. I sized these so that they could butt up against the hinges and still clear the doors. After installing the cubbies, I put the doors back on, and then I attached the door hardware, which are these simple modern bar pulls that I love. The last part of the build is the top. After ripping the top panel to width on the table saw, I brought it to the workbench to cut to length. I used my circular saw and AccuCut guide for the cut here, and to make sure that I didn't get any tear out on the top of the panel, I wrapped the cut line in blue tape, and this gives those wood fibers a little bit of extra support. I drilled pocket holes on the underside of the panel to hold the trim tight while the glue dried. The trim I'm using here is a 1x2 maple, and it's going to give the top a double thick look without having to fully double stack the plywood. I ran a bead of glue on the front trim and I secured it with screws through the panel, leaving the front piece long on both ends. Then I glued and butted the side trim against the front and screwed it in place. Now with the trim locked in place and the glue drying, I could cut the overhanging pieces flush for a nice tight butt joint at the corners. I used a piece of painter's tape here to protect the side trim while I was cutting it flush with the pull saw. And I did the same thing on the overhanging side pieces on the back. Now this is an easy way to get a nice looking joint without a lot of fuss. Next I cut some long strips from leftover pieces of plywood to fill out the front and back of the underside. This will give a solid place to rest on top of the cabinets and to secure it with screws. I added similar pieces to the sides to finish off the top. After I got done with that, I flipped the top over and I did some sanding on the top just to make sure all the trim and the plywood was flush and ready for finish. I applied 2 coats of poly to the top and then I started mounting those cabinets. Now, the leveling feet worked out great and they got everything aligned and level, and I secured the cabinets to the wall. Then I added the top and screwed it down from underneath. Now, since I was working with scraps, I ran out of long strips for the toe kick, so I'll need to add that on later. But I'm loving the look of this and the coordination of my upper and base cabinets now, and these extra little storage features give me some more versatility. And since these are only 20 inches deep, they're perfect for a working garage that needs to share space with other stuff, like cars, if you're into that kind of thing.
Now I am obviously in a corner over here, so the next thing I went to was a 60-inch workbench that had some 15-inch cabinets on each side with an opening for a desk and a nice hutch with pegboard on the top that I thought would be a great place to sit down and do projects, even though I filled it in later.
I'm building both cabinets at the same time out of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. Each side piece gets a toe kick notch, which I marked for and cut on the bandsaw. And if you're cutting these with a jigsaw, you can stack 2 sides together and cut them both at once, since you don't have a fence for repeated cuts like I do here. The cabinet sides are joined together by a bottom piece and 4 stretchers. And you want the width of the bottom and the length of the stretchers to be exactly the same, so take the extra time and make sure they match up when you're cutting them. An out-of-square cabinet here makes everything down the road a lot harder. And with a small cabinet like this, connecting the sides is a lot easier since you can use smaller clamps. I held the stretchers in place between the sides and attached them with pocket screws. And when putting the bottom on, make sure to check that it's 90 degrees to both the sides and your workbench before attaching it. If the bottom slopes from the front to the back of the cabinet, this can foul up your drawer install if you'll be using spacers like I do. The back stretchers are secured to the top and bottom to firm up the whole assembly and give an attachment point for anchoring to the wall. I'm using the same homemade adjustable leveling feet for the cabinets as I did before. I cut 3x3 blocks to beef up the base for the T-nuts that are going to be installed. Then I attached the blocks with glue and brad nails and moved on to the drawer slides while the glue dried. I typically install my slides with the cabinet sitting upright, but this time I tried it with the cabinet on its side. It's a bit easier doing it this way since you don't have to clamp the spacers in place or worry about the slides tipping over as you go to grab some screws. Just make sure that the slides remain at a right angle to the front of the cabinet since you don't have gravity holding everything down firmly to the bottom here. I have full detailed plans available for this whole build, including the exact measurements for the drawers, slides, and all the other parts. There's a link in the description, you can go check that out. To close up the cabinets, I cut backs for them out of 1/4 inch plywood, and I attached them with glue and staples to finish up the carcass. You can use brad nails as well, but staples are going to really hold better in a thin wood like 1/4 inch plywood. Next up was the drawers. I'm making 10 of them here, which means 40 parts with 4 different widths and 2 lengths. So having a cut list here is clutch, especially if you're trying to use odd size materials and offcuts from other projects like I did. I printed out the layout of my parts from SketchUp to get the most from each piece of plywood. Then I labeled the plywood with exactly what parts I needed to get from it. I set the table saw fence for each width I needed, and I cut all the parts that were that size. And after I cut the parts, I marked them off the little sticky note and kept that little note on the plywood until I'd gotten what I needed from each piece of plywood. Now this might seem like overkill, but I can't tell you how many times that I've tried to wing it and I end up cutting the wrong parts out of the wrong piece and then I end up having to buy more wood. And like they say, an ounce of planning is worth $48 of Baltic birch, or something like that. Now cutting the drawer fronts and backs to their final size is always a little bit tricky when using plywood. The total drawer width should be 1 inch narrower than the opening to account for the slides. And an easy way to check the sizing before you cut your parts is to do a dry fit in the cabinet. Use scraps to represent the sides and the front and see if they're going to move easily between the slides. Being a little bit under versus over is a better side to err on for a good fit and easy sliding drawers. I took the stack of parts back to the pocket hole jig and I drilled the fronts and the backs. And putting the drawers together goes pretty quick with a set of clamps to help things along. I finished off the drawers by cutting full-size 1/4-inch bottom panels for the boxes. And if your drawer box is a little out of square, there's an easy way to fix it here. Line up the bottom and staple the panel to the front edge, flush with the front of the box. And if the reveal running down the side isn't consistent, then just use the bottom panel and pull the side into square to make that reveal consistent and fix it into place with staples. You can finish up with more staples along the side and that thing's not going to move. After finishing the drawers, I moved back to the cabinet base. I drilled holes in the blocks that I installed earlier for the leveling feet. Each foot gets a 5/16 of an inch T-nut and a 2-inch carriage bolt that allows for leveling on uneven garage floors. And all garages should slope from front to back, so you're going to need these. I finished off the base by installing a toe kick on each cabinet with brad nails. I should really start calling these me nails more often. Maybe not. The last cabinet parts to make were the false drawer fronts. I cut them to size out of a large sheet of plywood to get that continuous grain look that I love so much. Then I applied 2 coats of water-based polyurethane to the fronts and the cabinet sides. Installing the drawers becomes pretty straightforward at this point, save for some minor adjustments. I used a 1/4-inch spacer for the bottom drawer, and then I stacked on a 3/4-inch piece for the next 2 drawers. Now the plywood that I'm using was even more undersized than normal, and that's going to add up after several drawers. So if your spacing gets too far off, you can get drawer bottoms and fronts running into each other, and that is no bueno. So an easy way to check where you're at and see if there's any interference is to mock up the fronts using an 1/8 of an inch spacer between them. And then you can see if there's anything going on between the drawers. And this one wasn't hitting, but I wanted to move it up anyway just to be safe since it was a little too close. Now before mounting the drawer fronts, I went ahead and I drilled the holes for the pulls first. Then I started at the bottom and I attached them to the drawer boxes with 1 1/4-inch pocket screws from the inside. After getting them all installed, I finished them off by extending the holes for the pulls all the way through the drawer box and attaching the hardware on the front. Now the top of the workbench is a plywood panel trimmed in hardwood like my other cabinets. I cut the panel to size and I used 3/4-inch maple for the trim. Now to cut the trim to the right width, I used 2 pieces of plywood to set the fence. Now this gave me about a 1 3/8 of an inch trim, which will marry up perfectly with the double stack of plywood that I'll be using on the edge. I attached the front trim to the top with pocket screws and glue, leaving the trim long on each side. Instead of leaving the side pieces long like I've done before, I went ahead and trimmed them to the exact size and joined them the same way as I did the front. After those were attached, I came back with a flush cut saw and trimmed off the excess length of that front trim. Instead of using 2 full-size pieces of plywood for the top, I used 3-inch strips along the edges and the front and the back to build it up and have a place to attach the lower cabinets. I glued and screwed the pieces down, and I put 2 more small strips in between the front and the back where the cabinets would overlap on that inner edge. I wrapped up the top by sanding all the seams flush and applying 2 coats of polyurethane. The finishing touch on the workbench is the hutch. I love having that light right above the workbench, and all that pegboard is great for easily accessible storage. So I left the design pretty much the same, but just made it a little bit sturdier. It's a 2-piece hutch with a frame for the pegboard held between the sides and top. I use pocket hole joinery for the whole thing for easy assembly, and it's pretty big so you might need some extra support, like scraps stacked on top of the cabinets that you just made. Note to self, make that larger assembly table. Pronto. Now considering the size of this hutch, putting finish on the parts before assembly also makes this task a lot easier. After making the frame, I joined the sides and the top of the hutch together. Then I moved on to the pegboard. I'm using just a basic white pegboard here, and I cut it to size to fit the frame. Now to assemble the hutch, I turned the top upside down and I brought over the frame. I clamped it on and I used some offcuts of the pegboard to set the frame forward a bit so that it would be flush on the back when it was attached. Now, working my way around the hutch, I connected the frame to the top and the sides with pocket screws. At this point, I brought over the 4-foot LED light that I'm going to be using, and I measured it for placement in the mounting hardware. I drilled holes and I installed some screw hooks, which I decided to replace with some screw eyes, which were a little bit smaller. You'll see that in a minute. Before mounting the pegboard, I located a spot to drill a hole for the power cord for the light. I'm probably going to come back later and drill a similar hole at the bottom to run a power strip so that I can have power accessible right there on the top of the workbench as well. The pegboard goes on with 5/8 of an inch screws around the frame, and that wraps everything up. I'm ready for final install. I couldn't take the old cabinets over to my dad's just yet, so this is a temporary setup over here on this wall. But for final assembly, I'm going to secure the top to the cabinets and the hutch to the top with hidden screws. And here are the screw eyes that I replaced. They're quite a bit shorter and they give you another usable row of the peg holes. Now this workbench is a great low-profile spot to work on projects and go through plans for your builds. I think this is going to be a great addition to a lot of people's garages, and I can't wait to get it in its final place and complete the look of my own shop organization.
Now a workbench like this could be used alone or integrated with other cabinets, and the hutch could be removed and replaced with wall cabinets. But the one thing that I found myself doing was storing more things underneath than I was really sitting there and doing planning. So what I realized is I needed the last piece of the puzzle, which is a 3-drawer cabinet to go in the well where I was sitting for the workbench.
Another 30-inch base cabinet will fit perfectly in between those other 2 cabinets on the bottom. The main difference here is making those large drawers which will replace any of the shelves that I had in the other ones. Now this process is the same as the 5-drawer cabinets, but as the drawers get bigger, you do need to make sure that they're sized right and that they are square and true during assembly. Now with the drawers built and installed, I removed them and drilled for the adjustable feet. I used threaded inserts and carriage bolts to give adjustability to each corner of the cabinet. You can also forego the toe kicks altogether and build the cabinets 3 inches shorter, then use a 2x4 base that you could shim and level all as one piece for longer runs of cabinets. This might be a little bit easier. Now after I installed the fronts and cabinet hardware, I moved the cabinet over for install. And you can see here how the modular nature works, and you can add and subtract from the setup fairly easily. I did need to detach the far cabinet to get everything aligned just right, and I screwed the cabinets together once they were in place. Now, as I mentioned, I have plans available for all these components. You can buy them individually, or you can get a discount for all of them. And you'll be able to get the plans for everything that you see here. Just check the link below in the description.
Now for the next part of the cabinet expansion, I wanted to start working on the miter saw station, so I added in another run of 5 foot of cabinets over here, starting off with the base cabinets.
Now, I'm using 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, and I think cutting it on the floor using rigid foam is the best approach for me. And on the floor, you can crawl on top of the sheets, which makes reaching across the panel a lot easier. I'm turning 3 sheets of plywood into 8 or 9 smaller pieces can get confusing, so I use sticky notes to label everything. Now, each section of plywood gets a number, and then I list what parts from my plan that I'll get out of that piece. And when I cut down a piece that's already been labeled, I'll transfer the parts it contains onto a new sticky and mark it off of the original piece. I also use some arrows to show which edges are the factory edges because I know they're almost always straight and at a right angle to each other. Now this may seem like overkill, but I make my plans with a very efficient plywood layout to save on materials. So cutting a part from the wrong panel might mean that you have to buy a whole new sheet of ply to fix it. And I'm a natural organizer and overthinker, so this tickles all the right spots for me. Now I can go to the table saw, and with a few cuts using those arrows as reference, I get really clean parts for the cabinet sides and bottoms.
Basically what I'm doing is I always cut the panels a little bit oversized. That factory edge is typically pretty straight, but it's pretty rough, so it's not going to work out great when you get into assembly and the connections there. So I cut it a little bit oversized using that rough factory edge against the fence first, and then I will go down to final size and cut off just a little sliver. And I do that so that every side of the panel will have a nice, clean, fresh table saw cut edge on it, and it's going to make joinery a lot easier.
I grabbed 2 of the sides and I picked the best faces for the exterior. And then I marked the inside lower corners of each of them, so when I cut my toe kicks, I actually have a left and a right with the good faces pointing outward. I like using a combination square to mark notches like this since it makes layout more repeatable. Now you can do a few setups on the bandsaw and get repeatable cuts, but I find it faster to just knock these out with a jigsaw. And these cuts don't have to be perfect since they're just going to be holding the toe kick. I jumped back to the table saw and I ripped some of the other panels to width so that I could get the next set of parts.
We want to make sure that the supports are the same size as the bottom, because if they're not, then your cabinet will flare out and your drawers won't fit right. There's two better options. One if you have a stop block on your miter saw, and one if you don't. So if you don't have a stop block on your miter saw, you can just set the support down on your piece and then mark exactly where it lines up. And now you can cut right on that line and not worry about any error on your tape measure. The other option is setting up a stop block with your miter saw. So the biggest benefit of using a stop block is getting consistent parts every time you cut it. And when I'm going to be cutting 8 of these parts, it's going to be nice to know that they're all exactly the same size.
I always square the end first to get a fresh face, and then cut the rest of the parts from the board on a miter saw. And even though I didn't show it here, it's a good idea to check the first part off the saw and confirm that that stop block is right where you want it before you make the rest of the cuts. And next up, it was time for joinery for the carcass. Now, I don't use it a ton, but I have a Craig Foreman on the underside of my flip-top cart. And you can get plans for the flip-top cart from my website. I jumped into assembly and I used my combination square to get a consistent offset for the bottom. I love this thing, and the fact that it was my granddad's tool makes it even better. There's nothing like a good hand-me-down family tool. I secured the bottom with 1 1/4 inch pocket screws, and then I flipped it around to attach the top supports. Now, these supports will also be used to secure the top to the cabinets later. If you're having issues getting those bottom screws in place with a clamp in the way, you can always just flip it up and move it out of the way while you drive those bottom screws. The back supports get butted up against the bottom and that upper support that I just installed. Now, these add a place to secure the cabinet to the wall in 2 spots and make it really stable. Now, adding screws into the supports from the top and the bottom also really solidifies the carcass, and it does a great job keeping it from racking, which you'll see later. I grabbed the parts for the second cabinet, and the second one is always easier, right? I really don't know what to say here. No matter how hard I try, I always seem to have at least one blunder in every project.
It's okay, we're okay.
But it's kind of become a fun game now. I'm just going through every project, wondering when I'm going to get to flash up that mistakes were made banner. Am I going to drop a panel, drill an errant hole, or maybe just slap myself in the face with a board? Who knows? So go ahead and get subscribed if you want to see what I screw up next time, or if you just need a little reminder that somebody else out there is on the struggle bus with you. And next I cut panels for the back to finish the carcass. I checked the cabinet for square, and the diagonal measurements were within a 32nd of each other, so I'll call that good.
So if you've cut all your pieces square into the right sizes, most of the time you're going to be pretty dead on. But this is a great way to check before you go into it, because if somehow you had the pieces messed up, you can adjust it now before you put the back on, and you definitely want to do that before you start trying to install the drawers, because if it's out of whack, then it'd be really hard to get things aligned. Let's go ahead and put the back on now.
The back gets attached with glue and some good old me-nails to hold it in place while the glue dries. And once the back is secured, the cabinet is really locked into place and it's going to resist racking during install. Before taking the carcass off of the bench, I marked some offcuts to beef up the base for leveling feet. I'm not sure if I'm going to actually use leveling feet on this build, since the slope of the garage is pretty severe. I might make a full base to put the cabinets on so I can raise them up high enough to be level across that whole 13-foot run. 13 feet is going to be amazing, by the way. But if you need them, you can drill holes in the doubled up plywood and put threaded inserts in and use them as leveling feet for the cabinets. With the carcass complete, I moved on to cutting the drawers. Now, there were plenty of cuts to make, and sometimes you gotta play a game of chicken between finishing the cut and tipping over your camera tripod. Now, luckily I won this game. I cut the parts to rough width first, and then I cut them down to final size using that clean edge that I just made. And to cut the parts to length, I brought in old Fred the sled instead of using the miter saw. Wide parts like this just aren't great for a fixed miter saw. I did the side parts first because I could just match their length to my drawer slides. And like before, I cut the pieces a little long to get one square end. Then I moved the stock block in to get a final cut and ran all the pieces through to finish up the sides.
Cutting the sides for drawers is really easy because you just cut them the size of the actual drawer slide, so 18 inches in my case. But cutting the fronts, that's another story because of undersized plywood. I get a ton of questions, and I'm gonna make it super easy for you guys.
Okay, I was editing this and my on-screen explanation was not as super easy as I wanted. So let's do this instead. Now the drawer fronts and backs follow this formula. Measure the interior width of your cabinet. Then subtract 1 inch for the thickness of the full extension slides, 1/2 inch on each side. Now subtract the thickness of 2 pieces of your drawer material, and that gives you your measurement for your fronts and your backs. And the trick that I've been using lately is to make those fronts and backs just a smidge smaller. I'm talking like a 32nd of an inch, or a millimeter for my metric friends. And this will make your drawers slide smoother and avoid binding. After checking my first piece, I worked my way through the rest of them. And when those were done, I jumped back over to the foreman to drill pocket holes in the fronts and backs. I kind of felt like these parts were a little bit undecided, but I don't know. I guess they'll just choose sides in a minute. Now, after they all paired up, I grabbed a set and put the clamps on them to hold everything square. I drove in the screws to hold everything tight, and then I cut some 1/4 inch plywood panels for the bottoms. Now for quick assembly, I'm using a glued and nailed on bottom. Just keep your nails 3/8 of an inch out from the edges. And I put a chamfer on the bottom with a handheld router to finish off the drawers.
So now putting the chamfer on the bottom of this drawer does hide it from view when you're looking at it from the side, so you can't see the plywood, and make sure that those nails are away far enough that the chamfer is not going to hit it. That's why we place them there. And I love this glued on bottom. It's nice and solid and doesn't rattle, and it's plenty strong.
I gave all the drawers the same treatment, and then I moved one of the cabinets onto the bench to install the drawer slides. Now putting the cabinet on its side makes this easier so you're not fighting gravity. I spaced the slides off the bottom using a scrap of plywood and the measurements from my plans. If you want to build your own set of these cabinets and you want to hit the easy button, you can get the cut lists, parts diagrammed, and step-by-step instructions. You can head down to the link below in my description to get those. And also, if you want to get the entire garage cabinet bundle, you can get that at a discount too. And I appreciate your support. I flipped the cabinet over and I used the same spacers on the other side to get my matched slide positions.
With the slides installed, we can put in the drawers and then just use some spacers to space everything out. The first one is going to go right on top of a 1/4 inch sheet of plywood. So let's see how this looks. Oh yeah. So leaving the drawer a 32nd of an inch between the slides gives it just a little bit of wiggle room, and it's going to be a lot easier for install, and it's going to slide smoother too.
Now while the drawer rested on the plywood, I pulled the slides flush with the front and secured them in 2 spots before removing the drawer and adding a 3rd screw to the back. Now the next 2 drawers use spacers set on the drawer below it for positioning. I got them mounted in the cabinet pretty easily. And to get the drawer fronts, I cut a large piece of plywood to cover the entire front of the cabinet with appropriate reveals around the edges. Then I set my saw to the height of the false drawer fronts and cut the panel into 3 parts.
I love continuous grain looks on the front of drawers, and so that's a great way to do it. And I'll stack them up here and try not to let them fall like I did before. But you can see that that grain just flows right through from all 3 panels, and having that 1/8 inch kerf on the blade means I'm going to have a perfect 1/8 inch reveal between all of them when I get them mounted up here.
I sanded the drawer fronts and I gave them a couple coats of polyurethane, and then I prepped the cabinet while they were drying. A word of caution here. Do not extend more than 1 drawer at a time or lean on an extended drawer while the cabinet is on your bench.
Ooh, do not tip that over.
Of course, unless you're looking for a great shop horror story to tell your buddies, because you'll get it. After drilling mounting holes in the drawer boxes, I drilled the hardware holes in the false drawer fronts. I like drilling them before they get put in place so that I can use those holes during the mounting process.
All right, I'm gonna mount the drawer fronts from the bottom up, and I'm gonna use this little scrap here. I got a hole in it, and I'm just gonna screw it to the bottom so I can rest that bottom shelf right on it. And it's gonna make installation a lot easier than trying to clamp everything in place.
Then you can just put the fronts on in 4 steps. Now first, I'd align the fronts and get consistent reveals on each side. Then I would hold it in place and use those hardware holes to attach the front to the drawer box. This lets me open the drawer and permanently attach the drawer front with 2 screws on the inside on the holes I drilled earlier. Then finally I remove those screws from the front of the hardware holes and the drawer is ready. Now the technique works great, and I first saw this from my buddy Mark over at the Wood Whisperer. The Wood Whisperer. I used an 1/8 of an inch spacer between the fronts to give the reveal that I needed and to finish it off. And then I could come back and drill through the drawer box for the hardware and put those handles on. On the second go around, I did find it much easier to work my way up one drawer at a time from the bottom instead of having all 3 drawers in there. Plus, this reduces the chances of you getting flattened like a pancake. I cleared out the spot for the cabinet to go on the wall, but I am cheating a bit here. I'm going to be using the top from the base cabinets in my garage cabinet bundle that I showed earlier. That's because the left side of my miter saw setup is going to get extended a bit, and I'll be making a new top for that left side that's a bit longer. So I decided to wait and shim everything together at once when I do that too. But these deep drawers are great for storing extra supplies, and they're going to be perfect in the miter saw station, which we'll be continuing in the next video in this series.
Next up, I transitioned into making the upper cabinets and starting to fill in the area where I'd really put the miter saw station, but I also expanded some more cabinets on this other side so I could have a full 75 inches of side feed for the miter saw.
I started off by taking down all my lumber so that I could move the lumber racks and make way for those upper cabinets.
All right, you can really start to get a feel for what this is going to look like, the 13 feet, and that's the great thing about the modular cabinet system that I'm using. So these cabinets right now are all 30 inches. So using the modular cabinets, I'm upgrading from 60 to 75 inches of cabinets on the left and having 60 inches of cabinets to the right with a space in the middle for the miter saw. I'm going to show you some other setups as we go through the video, and they're all based on the modular cabinet designs. I'm going to jump in and start building this 4-drawer cabinet. I'm going to hit some of the highlights because we got a lot of cabinets to build today. Now let's go ahead and jump into the building. I'm ready for assembly of the carcass, and one of the questions that I get a lot is about the pocket hole assembly and how to keep everything straight and they don't move. So one of the things about pocket holes is when you're screwing them in, sometimes they have a tendency to kind of move and shift a little bit. So what I've always found is just to clamp it until the life is about squeezed out of it. Clamp it very tightly and then work your way down, starting from the edges, and go to the center, and you should have some good results. To level out this little guy, I put on these little blocks here, and that is so I can use a 5/16 T-nut and a 5/16 carriage bolt. So I'll drill into here, tap those in, and be able to screw them in. But this is a great DIY option for a leveling foot. All right, now the cabinet is done. Let's jump into some drawers. Now here's a setup if you're tight on space. With 30-inch cabinets on either side of the saw, you'll come in right under 8 feet of wall space used, and you'll be ready for 8-foot boards. Now of course you'll want to fill in and use that space under the saw and above it, and I'm going to be figuring out what that looks like for my setup on the next video. All right, I got the little base cabinet done, and now I can move to getting the top made. So I need a 75-inch top for this left side, and then I'm gonna move that 60-inch top over there. So I'm gonna cut that down using some plywood, and then I'm gonna trim it with maple, and I'll use pocket screws to attach that from inside so you won't see any fasteners. All right, I'm gonna mill up some rough lumber for the trim. This is soft maple, and I'm gonna take it through my planer and joiner, and then the table saw to get it down to the thickness. We've got everything in place for the bases now. Got the top, and now I have to disassemble all of this, clear everything off, get everything out of these cabinets so I can unscrew them from the wall and then start moving around. And that's the nice thing about these being modular, and one of the reasons I designed them that way is so that I can rearrange these how I want. I'm actually gonna move this cabinet down and put the 15-inch drawers right in between them. And then I can make a level line across it and start shimming everything up to that line. All right, so I did run into one small problem here. I have a little kick out over here, so these cabinets are all the way up against the side, and these are just where I had them originally. And when I take the measurement, I'm coming in right at 24 inches. Wouldn't you know it, my saw is 24 and 3/4 inches wide. So I've got to move both of these cabinets down that way, which means I'll have to move the uppers as well later. Make sure you take into account how wide your miter saw is, and if you're going to be upgrading, you might want to go a little bit wider. Now this next setup is probably the best use of space and usability for what you can cut. With two 30-inch cabinets to the left and one to the right, you're just under 10 feet of wall space. But you can go against a wall and still have 6 feet of cutting capacity for those longer boards. And converting those lower cabinet doors into 3 big drawers is my personal favorite. So to level the two cabinets across the span, first of all, I got a little green laser line set up. I'm gonna get the cabinet leveled to where the bottom is. Then I'll put the top on and I'll use a straight edge or my 4-foot level to really span across and make sure that these are in the same plane, because that's really important. I'm adding a piece of maple trim to the back of the original top, and that's because I made the other top an inch deeper just to give me a little bit more room for the infeed, which you'll see probably in the next video when I mount the miter saw. All right, everything is now level. I had to pull out the big guns, literally. I went out and got a 78-inch level because with trying to use a 4-foot level over that span just didn't work great. And getting everything level with those leveling feet is a bit tedious, but it is worth the effort. So just hang in there, use that big level to your advantage, and just keep working it until you get everything just right. Then once you lock everything into the wall, it's not going anywhere. All right, now I can put everything back onto the base cabinets that I had moved around, clear the shop vac out, and get started on the upper cabinets. The first one I'm gonna do is a 15-inch upper cabinet, and that is just gonna be a single door with adjustable shelves. For the upper cabinets, I use a 1/2-inch plywood back, and that allows you to put screws anywhere through that back because it gives it a lot of rigidity. So what I need on the sides is a rabbet to hold that in place and make it really strong. So I'm using a dado or rabbet fence. I've got this rabbet fence that I'm going to attach onto the table saw, and then that's going to let me put the rabbet on the side of there, and basically it just makes a groove on the side where that back panel is going to go. It's a pretty good way to make a really solid upper cabinet. I've got the little carcass for the 15-inch, and I'm just going to do shelf pins in this one. I'm going to use a little shelf pin jig and just put the adjustable shelf pin holes in there so that I can just have 2 or maybe even 3 shelves in there, and I'll store large items. I'm going to do more on the other upper cabinets. So I'm going to drill those in. Then after that, we'll just attach a drawer with European hinges, and we'll be good to go. I'm gonna put some finish on the door before I assemble it. I'm using Halcyon Clear, which is a water-based polyurethane from Total Boat, and I'll be using that on all the cabinets. And the doors, I'm not gonna do the interiors though, because it's just shop furniture. Now in this example, it might not seem like much, but adding just a 15-inch cabinet to each side from example 3 makes a huge difference. You get more support, and using those 15-inch cabinets for 5 small drawers is great for hand tools, measuring devices, and other little stuff that always seems to get lost. All right, the last cabinets for this section are gonna be 2 more of these upper cabinets. They're gonna be exactly like the ones I have before. I've got the parts cut already for these, so I'm just gonna give you a brief overview while I'm making them. The 2 cabinets are set up a little bit differently. The first one is split down the middle with a divider, and then it has adjustable shelves. So after assembly, I went in there and drilled some shelf pin holes on the left and the right side, and then made some little shelves. I also made some racks that get mounted on the door, so I went ahead and used 3 door hinges instead of 2 to carry the extra weight. And then between all those doors, it gives a great amount of storage so that you can put all kinds of different things, and you can obviously mix and match. On the second one, I wanted some adjustable storage cubbies on the bottom. So what I did was made some grooves on the bottom with a dado blade, and then made some panels that I could slide in there. And so basically you can pull it out and adjust it to make it whatever size storage you need for what you're gonna store in there. On the top, I just did a regular adjustable shelf, so I drilled some shelf pin holes and used a half-depth shelf. And after getting all the carcasses assembled, I went ahead and finished everything and then got them ready for assembly up on the wall. Now the final setup is boss level mode. If you have an entire back wall of a 2-car garage to dedicate, this setup is amazing. You can work with almost any board size you want. You're gonna have a ton of storage, and it's gonna set you back about a month's salary for all that plywood and drawer slides. But if you get this one, you will have the ultimate setup, and you can choose from any variety and combination of doors and drawers for the best miter saw station setup you can think of. And of course, you can use the modular cabinet plans for all these setups. I'll have a link down below in the description where you can check those out. So it's finally time to hang the upper cabinets, but I ran into a problem. And when I mean a problem, I mean that I am too much of a perfectionist for my own good. This is the 15-inch cabinet, and I was just gonna add this in or add it in between, but it is a lot lighter than the other cabinets, at least for my taste. And I don't wanna be sitting here talking and having mismatched cabinets behind me for the rest of my YouTube career. So I'm gonna grab these, move them down here, and then put all 3 of the new cabinets right here behind me for a nice crisp look. You may think that's overkill, and you'd be right. But I'm gonna do it anyway. Let's go. Yeah! Woo! Oh man, this looks so good. I've got so much storage in these cabinets now, it is insane. But what I'm really excited for next is getting the miter saw installed and getting that all set up.
Now with all the cabinets built, I could really start working on the miter saw station and converting my old miter saw stand into what you see here now, including the track and the stop and all the cool things that a miter saw station should have.
I built this mobile miter stand 5 years ago, and it's been a workhorse in my shop. It's got some great features like the folding wings, obviously the mobility, and an awesome stop block system, plus the automated vacuum. It's been a great addition to the shop, but it's time to say goodbye and say hello to the new miter saw station. All right, we're ready to add the miter saw into the station, but the problem is I don't have power right here. Here's the only outlet on this wall, and I've got to go through 3 studs to get into this bay. So I'm just going to take the whole strip out at once, and it's going to make patching it a lot easier.
Now, odds are, if you're working in a garage, you're going to need to add some outlets to your walls at some point, unless you love tripping over extension cords. Now, I like using a multi-tool with a drywall blade on it to follow the lines that I've drawn out. After making the cuts with the multi-tool, I started prying out the piece of drywall. I was trying to be gentle here so that I didn't snap it and just make more work for myself. And after a little finessing and some cutting with my utility knife, I got the patch out in one piece. I drilled holes through the center of the studs to run the wire, and I probably should have made the opening a bit bigger and gone above where the box was going to be, but this worked out okay. I even got to make a little insulation cotton candy. Now then I ran a piece of wire back through the holes to the box. I'm not going to get into the details of the connection and wiring of the box here. There's plenty of great resources out there for your specific situation you can look up. Just make sure you follow all your local codes if you're going to do it yourself. Now before putting the drywall back in place, I nailed some wire protectors over the studs. I've heard some people don't use them. Frankly, I think that's pretty shocking. Now next, I needed a cutout for the new box that I put in. So I transferred the measurements to the drywall and made the plunge cuts with the multi-tool. And when I installed that patch back in, it fit like a glove. I drove in the screws at all the stud locations above and below the cut lines, and then I could move on to repairing the drywall. I still hate doing drywall, but coming off of that wall repair in my bathroom remodel I just did, I felt like I was in a groove. I got it done in just 3 coats, which is like a record for me. And after a little primer and paint, it was looking good.
The electrical work and the drywall is all finished up, and I got this nice new outlet. And it doesn't look like much, but that took a lot of work. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, make sure you get a licensed electrician. But now we can finally get started on installing the miter saw, and we're going to start with a shelf to put it on.
I measured the area between the cabinets, and it wasn't perfectly square, but it was close enough. Now the shelf is 3/4 inch Baltic birch, just like the rest of the cabinets, and I cut it a little oversized so that I can trim it to the final width later. I drilled pocket holes in the underside to attach the front trim as well. Now my wood bin is a treasure trove of offcuts, and I found a stick of maple that I had used for the trim on the cabinets, and this is going to match it just right. Now, with a few milling operations, I had the trim cut down to size and ready for install. Now, the trim gets attached with glue and pocket screws that I had just drilled to hold it tight while the glue is drying. And after it was dry, I took the panel over to my buddy Fred and I trimmed it to the exact width of the opening. Well, exactly to the smallest size of the unsquare opening, I guess. I'm going to use some small cleats made from plywood to attach the shelf to the cabinets, so I went ahead and ripped those down and cut them to size as well. I have the little strips I'm going to mount that are going to hold the shelf, and those are going to go down so that the top of the shelf will be 4 inches below the surface. I found that 4 inches seems to take into account most of the miter saws that are out there. There might be some that are more than that, so make sure that you measure your own miter saw, but mine's actually about 3 3/4, and I'm going to shim up from there. And then that way, if I switch the miter saw out, I won't have to move this. I can just shim it to a different rate for the next miter saw. I pre-drilled holes in the cleats for the screws, and then I set my combination square to 4 inches plus the thickness of my plywood. Now, a quick shot with my nail gun held it in place so that I could drive in the screws, and I checked it again with my combination square before securing it in place. Now, both cleats are also cut a little shorter and set back so that they won't interfere with the trim on the front edge of the shelf. I'm about to move the miter saw over, but before I do, I want to address some questions that I had in the last video. I've gotten a lot of questions about why am I getting rid of the miter saw stand and moving into the miter saw station and going from mobile to the wall mount. First of all, I love this thing. This is one of my favorite projects that I've built. Between this one and the flip top, plans available down below, link in the description. But between these two pieces, they have been great workhorses in the workshop. It just adds a ton of flexibility with the folding wings. In the stop block on here, this has just been huge, having that stop block. So it's not about the functionality at all. This still works great. The original plan was not actually to have a space. It was just to add 2 more cabinets of the 30-inch wall cabinets and base that I had. But what I quickly realized is that I'm going to have all of this countertop on the top of these base cabinets, and so I thought I want to do double duty. And so I turned this into the miter saw station. So what's going to happen is I'm going to be able to get rid of the mobile miter saw station, the rolling wood cart, as well as this rackety wood rack. So that's kind of the reasoning behind it, is really just to better utilize my space. So up to you for your shop. Do you want mobility, and do you really need to put everything against the wall when you're done? Or are you going to have storage? And for me, it was just an evolution. So that's what it is. Hope that answers it for you guys. Now let's get this saw on there. I unplugged the saw and I took the bolts out that were holding it down, and then I huffed it on over to the shelf. And when I came back, I was having minor heart palpitations, seeing all the dust stored up under the miter saw. So I grabbed the most used tool in my shop, the vacuum, and I sucked everything up, and the world was right again. I know I've got problems.
And I've got it in here, and the biggest concern I have right now is the dust collection, because I've got it almost up against the wall. These are 20-inch deep cabinets, and I wanted those so they have low profile, but that doesn't give me a lot of room. Also, I can't use the slider. So right now I've got 9 inches of actual space between the fence and the edge right here, which is more than what I had on the mobile miter saw stand. I'm gonna use the shop vac for the time being with the automated switch, which I'll show you here in a minute. So I'm gonna figure out what the right position is, and I'm gonna have to figure out some fittings to make that hose work.
I put the hose in the saw's dust port, and I was moving it from side to side to see how it would react to the full motion for my saw. Now the right side seemed to get stuck a little more often since the bevel lock is over on that side, so I decided to go with the hose on the left to make sure that it would stay free and not be caught on anything. I made a mark on the back of the shelf, and I used a roll of electrical tape to trace for the cutout for the hose. A jigsaw makes short work of the cut, and it was a perfect fit for my hose. And while I was on the bench, I put a couple coats of polyurethane on the shelf for some protection. I'll be using the same dust collection setup as my mobile stand, at least to start off with, so I pulled everything out to transfer it over. Now the setup is pretty simple, but this yellow box here is where the magic happens. It's an iVac automated vacuum switch, and it triggers the shop vac when the miter saw is turned on. Then it runs for a few seconds afterwards as well. Now I'd like to hard pipe in a 4-inch hose at some point, but that'll be a whole undertaking since my dust collector's on the other side of the shop, and this setup works pretty well. Now I countersunk some holes in the shelf and set it in place for a test fit. Then I ran the power and vacuum lines through the hole that I drilled out to see how everything fit and moved.
So getting the right fittings for dust collection is always a hassle, and I have this hose here that don't have a great fitting to go into the back of the miter saw, which is not a standard size. So I bought a 3D printer about a year ago, and I've been playing around with it for a while, but it's really cool to be able to do things like this. I printed up this little transition that'll go from the miter saw into the hose, but my machine was maybe 250 bucks, and I've been using it to make cool little things like this, and I think it's gonna pay off for itself in the long run. So this was a cool one. It only took me a few hours to design and print it.
The hose was catching on the vacuum switch power cord, so I installed a right angle extension cord, and then it cleared just fine. I also realized I wanted the shelf a little bit further forwards so that it was flush with the tops and not the doors. I drilled another set of holes, I rounded over the now exposed corners, and then I attached the shelf to the cleats. I used the same maple spacers from the mobile stand, and when I put the level across everything, it was very close. Now the saw was just a little bit lower, and I used some playing cards to fit under the level to know how much I needed to shim it up. Then I moved those cards under the maple spacers, and I secured the saw with the same bolts that I'd used before. Now pulling the shelf forward did leave a gap in the back, so I made my first cut on the new miter saw station to get a filler strip. Oh yeah, I am gonna like this.
So for a stop block system for the miter saw stand, I'm going to be using some Craig mini track, and I'm just going to route some little channels into the top. Now, unfortunately, I just dropped that, but also, unfortunately, I just spent a lot of time getting this exactly level, and I didn't think about the fact that I'm going to have to route the channel into the top. So I'm going to have to remove that. And on top of that, I also did not plan at all for where I placed the fasteners into this top, meaning the screws as well as the brad nails to hold in the cleating and the trim. So I have a potential minefield of metal just waiting to destroy my router bit inside of this top. So don't be like me and plan ahead for where your track is going to go. That would be the smart thing to do. But I do have a little metal detector that I'm gonna see if this will help me find that metal in there. I'm also gonna review the footage from the past videos and see if I can figure out where it's at. Wish me luck.
Before taking off the saw, I did screw down the maple spacers to make reinstall a little bit easier. And after the saw was out, I tried to do a little detective work to find those nails and screws. And apparently my microphone was off, so it sounded something like this. Beep, beep, beep. I was able to find the screws and some of the me nails, but I just tried to avoid the screws because there was a lot of brads. Now I don't have an edge guide, so I used a long strip of 1/2-inch MDF cut to size that would put my bit right where I wanted it for the T-track. I also temporarily glued on a block of wood at the end of the cut to prevent blowout on that edge. The track is only 3/8 of an inch tall, so I set the router to take it all in one pass. And I've got to be honest here, this was by far the worst part of the project for me. Now, y'all know how I feel about dust, and I was dreading this. But Susan helped me out, and she followed along with the hose from the dust collector and one of those big gulp attachments, which altogether, this was extremely loud. Even with Susan following me with the dust hose, this made a huge mess. I would be having nightmares about this until Valentine's Day. I also routed a small recess for the metal measuring tape that I'll be using, but this one was a walk in the park compared to that dust storm. Now, when I was done, I brought the miter saw back and installed it on the shelf so that I could cut the T-track easier. And while I was at it, I went ahead and cut down the hose on the shop vac. Now this should help improve the dust collection at least a tiny little bit. Now, I used two 4-foot sections of the T-track, and the first one I used was a full stick. So I just pre-drilled the holes and installed it with some small screws. The second piece did need to be cut, and I did that on the miter saw. You can cut aluminum with carbide tooth blades, just go slow and you'll be fine. Now the track sat just below the surface, and now it's ready for a stop block, which I'll be making from some more plywood.
I glued up a little block of wood for the stop block, and what I'm going to do is actually put a little flip stop on the end, and I'm going to make that out of some 1/8" steel plate here, so it'll be nice and sturdy.
I made some rough layout marks, and then I cut the metal plate with my portaband. Now if you don't have steel or the tools to cut it, you can also make this out of aluminum or even wood. Now since I am using steel, I rounded the sharp edges and the corners with my grinder. Then I eyeballed where the stop needed to go, and I drilled a 1/4" hole through it for my rotation point. After that, I drilled a matching 1/4" hole through the length of the stop block, and that's where that bolt's going to go. I'm using a strip of maple to guide the stop block in the T-track, and I cut it to size, and then I cut a matching groove down the middle of the block on the table saw. And after gluing the maple runner into place, I drilled another hole through the center of the block for the locking hardware. I laid out where the T-bolt would go, and then I started chiseling out the notch for the top of the T-bolt head. And apparently, hard maple doesn't take kindly to getting pounded with a chisel.
Oh. No.
But the joke's on him, because I've cracked more wood than Jack Torrance, and I know a quick glue job fixes a clean split easy peasy. So after I finished clearing out the notch, I glued the runner back on, and we were back in business. I also wanted one of those adjustable indicators on the stop block so that I could read the ruler just like on my old setup. So I cleared a spot out on the bottom corner with a Forstner bit and my chisel. Then I drilled a slot through the bolt so I could make some fine adjustments to it. Now the visual indicator is just some 1/8" polycarbonate that I cut to size. Then I scored a line on it and filled that line in with red marker, and then I removed the rest that was on the surface with alcohol, and it left behind the red line that worked surprisingly well. I countersunk a hole in the polycarbonate, and then I was ready to assemble the stop block.
I get all the parts now, and here's how the stop block goes together. I did actually drill another hole to put the knob back a little bit further. But here is the piece, and also I did put a little notch in it so it wouldn't knock out the acrylic thing. The metal flip stop goes in. I have a little spacer / washer there, and then a lock nut so that this will stay in place. On the back side, we have the little indicator, I guess we'll call it an indicator, and that little red line in there works really cool. So this little guy just goes up into the bottom, and did make the slot so that's adjustable. This was off the design by Jay Bates when he did it, made a stop block for his miter station. All right, and then I can adjust this part back and forth as I need to, and we'll do that in just a minute on the miter saw station. And then to finish it off, just have a little T-bolt. I'm going to put this through the back hole, and there we go. Kind of looks like a monstrosity, but it's going to work well. Let's get it installed.
I set the stop block in the track, and I grabbed a 23 1/4" board that I had left over. It's just a random length. And I used that to mark the approximate spot where the tape measure should read 23 1/4". Then I pulled out the stop block and I installed the adhesive tape measure into the recess slot. I lined it up with that mark that I had just made. Now after that, I could fine tune my indicator using a few cuts of that scrap wood and then making the adjustments from the top. I got it dialed in and I was good to go. Now I'm really loving this stop block. The flip stop works awesome and it is totally solid with no flex to it. Now this whole miter saw station really came together just how I wanted it. I am pumped to put it to use in my future projects and add some storage under the cabinets and possibly hard pipe in some dust collection later.
The last piece that I added to the miter saw station was this dust hood right here, and it's a really simple build. I just used some 1/2-inch plywood and I screwed it together, and I made some cutouts on the back because I have that outlet back there. Need to make sure that I could get access to that. I also had to do a little bit of notching down there on the bottom so it would fit over the back of the miter saw legs. I built it to fit exactly in between the cabinets so I could just put it in there, and it's a nice flush fit with the front of the fence, and it just sits in there nicely. And really all it's doing is catching the dust so it doesn't just spread around the back. It would be nicer to have a 4-inch dust port on that and try to actively pull some dust in, but that might be a future upgrade. Once again, we do have plans available for all of these cabinets, so if you want to build some of your own, there's a link down below in the description. I hope this compilation has helped inspire you and think of what you can do in your workshop to get better organization. I'm Brad. Until next time, get out there and build something awesome.